There was a promise made 7 years ago, not a formal one. Not the kind that involves witnesses or documentation or the specific ceremony of two people deciding that what they are agreeing to is significant enough to be marked in some way that makes it harder to undo. An informal promise, the kind made between two people who have known each other long enough that formality would feel like an insult to the understanding between them. The kind where the words are simple and the meaning behind them is not simple at all. And both people know this and neither of them needs to say so. He said, "What happens between us stays between us." The friend said, "Always." 7 years. That promise held across 7 years of things that would have tested a lesser version of it. Across moments where the temptation to share what he knew would have been significant, where the information he was carrying was the kind that the world wanted and was looking for and would have received with enormous appetite. Across periods where people were asking him directly, where the questions came from directions that made refusing them costly, where staying silent required something active rather than simply the passive maintenance of a commitment made long ago, he stayed silent. The promise held. Until 3 weeks ago. I want to tell you why it broke, before I tell you what broke with it, because the breaking of a 7-year promise is not a small thing, and it did not happen carelessly, and the reason it happened matters more than the fact of it, matters more than anything that was said in the breaking. Because the reason tells you something about what the promise had been protecting, and why the protection finally became something the friend could no longer maintain. He had watched something for a long time. This is how he describes the period leading up to the breaking, as watching. Being present in the life of someone he had promised to protect without being able to intervene in what he was watching. Having the specific helplessness of someone whose commitment to silence had become, over time, a form of participation, and something he had not agreed to participate in when he made the commitment. He had promised to keep what happened between them private. He had not promised to keep what was happening to him private. This is the distinction he makes. Careful, deliberate. The distinction of someone who has thought about this for a long time and has arrived at the place where breaking the promise feels less like betrayal and more like the only honest thing left available to him. What he had promised to protect was their history, the private conversations, the shared moments, the specific texture of a friendship that had been built over years and that contained things belonging only to the two of them. He is not giving those things away. What he is giving is different. What he is giving is what he watched. What happened not between them, but to one of them. And the time that the promise was being kept and the keeping of it required the friend to stand at a specific distance from what he was observing and do nothing with what he saw. He is done standing at that distance. Let me tell you what he saw. The first thing, the thing he reaches for first when he begins the telling, the thing that he considers the foundation of everything that follows, is a change, not dramatic. Not the kind of change that announces itself and demands a response and makes it impossible for the people close to the person changing to pretend they have not noticed. The quiet kind. The kind that happens so gradually that you can only see it clearly in retrospect. When you place the person you knew at the beginning of a period next to the person you know at the end of it and observe the distance between them. The distance was significant. He describes the person he knew 7 years ago, when the promise was made, when the friendship was at the specific density that produced the promise, as someone who occupied his own life completely, who was present in every room he entered, not in a performed way of someone who has learned to seem present, but in the genuine way of someone who is actually there, actually inside the moment, actually in contact with what is happening rather than managing his contact with it from a slight remove. That person changed, not all at once, slowly, across years, in ways that the friend noticed and filed and did not speak about, because the promise held and because each individual change was small enough to be attributed to other things, to the natural evolution of someone moving through time and accumulating the weight that time accumulates in people who are carrying as much as he carries. But the changes added up, and what they added up to, when the friend finally allowed himself to see the full picture rather than the individual pieces, was someone who had moved from the inside of his own life to a position slightly outside it. Someone who was no longer inhabiting his experience but observing it. Present in every technical sense, in every room, at every obligation. Functioning completely, but present in the way of someone who has learned to operate their own life from a distance because being fully inside it has become for reasons that the friend is only now beginning to fully understand. Too much. Too much what? This is the question the friend sits with. He does not have a complete answer. He has a direction, a sense of where the answer lives without being able to state it with the precision that would satisfy someone looking for a clean explanation. He says, too much to feel completely? This is what he watched across 7 years. Someone learning gradually, without intending to, without choosing it as a strategy, to feel his own life at a slight remove, to process it from a distance that kept it manageable, to be the person his life required him to be without being fully inside the experience of being that person. He says this is not weakness. He is very clear about this, and he returns to it more than once in the telling, because he anticipates the interpretation and wants to prevent it before it forms. What he watched was not someone breaking down or falling apart or becoming less than he was. It was someone making an adaptation, a deeply human adaptation, the kind that people make when the weight of what they are carrying exceeds what can be felt completely without becoming unmanageable. The adaptation worked. That is the other part. He functions. He will continue to function with a completeness that most people will never observe any deviation from, because the deviation is not in the functioning, it is underneath it, in the private interior of someone who has learned to live slightly above his own experience rather than fully inside it. The friend watched this and kept the promise and said nothing, until he understood what the watching had cost both of them. He understood this slowly. The understanding arrived the way certain understandings arrive. Not as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual accumulation of smaller realizations that eventually reached the point where their combined weight produced something that felt like knowing. What he knew was this: the promise had been made to protect the friendship. The silence had become something that was working against the friendship, not by introducing dishonesty between them. They had remained honest with each other across the 7 years in the ways that the promise allowed, but by creating a space between what the friend knew and what he was willing to say that had grown, across time, into a distance of its own. He was losing him to the silence. Not completely. Not in any way that was visible or that either of them had named, but in the specific way that things are lost when they are not spoken about for long enough. They become private to the person experiencing them in a way that closes off the other person, and the closing off accumulates, and the accumulation becomes a wall that neither person built deliberately, but that both of them are now on opposite sides of. The friend broke the promise to break down the wall, not to expose, not to give the world what it had been looking for across years of wanting access to the private version of someone they had only ever seen the public version of. To say out loud, to someone finally, after 7 years of saying it to no one, what he had been watching and what it meant and what he believed needed to happen. He said he needs someone to go inside with him, not to fix what is there, not to resolve or repair or return him to the version that existed before the adaptation became necessary, to simply be present inside it with him, to be the person who refuses the distance, who does not accept the slightly removed version because they know the fully present one exists, and they are not willing to pretend the distance is acceptable. That is what the closest friend broke 7 years of silence to say. Not a scandal, not a revelation in the form anyone was expecting. A loyalty that outgrew the promise that was supposed to contain it. He broke his word because keeping it had become the least loyal thing he could do. 7 years. And the most important thing he had to say was not a secret. It was a refusal. A refusal to keep watching from a distance the person he had promised 7 years ago to stay close to. He stayed close. That is what breaking the promise meant. That is all it ever meant.